Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is the Lian Li O11 Dynamic Evo RGB. In this video, I'm going to be unboxing and setting this case up, and more importantly, I'm going to be showing you how to do it in a basic build, so a standard setup that's uncomplicated and fairly straightforward, so you can end up with a view that looks something like this. Now, obviously, standard traditional horizontal GPU, Lian Li's RGB fans naturally, Lian Li cooler, and some other things, but obviously this is a standard layout. I've done a deep dive on this case if you're interested and want to find out more about it. So if you want to see all the different options that are available, but I thought it'd be useful to do an in-depth build guide, step by step, to show you everything you need to do to end up with a result that looks like this, which is obviously featuring Lian Li's TL LCD fans, as well as the standard TL fans, and there's a mix of reverse blade and standard orientation 120mm fans in here, a 360mm radiator, and more. Now, I'll leave specs in the description down below, as well as links to other videos that I've done on the LCD AIO, which is Galahad 2, and the wiring of the fans if you want to find out more about that. But I'm going to start by showing you various highlights of the case and then talking through the steps of building in it, things to know, motherboard setup, power supply unit wiring, and more. You'll see when you go to take this case apart, obviously you need to take the lid off first, and basically there's a lot of thumb screws holding things in place. Quick note, there are no magnetic dust filters on any of the panels. So it's something to bear in mind with this case. Over time, it may well get dirtier. You can see the back panel and the top panel don't have any mesh filters on them, for example. The bottom does, but otherwise there isn't anywhere else. Now, as standard, it comes with these brackets mounted to the rear fan tray. So you can see them as standard mounted there. This area is usually for fans or radiators, and I am actually going to put some fans on there. But if you wanted to, you could put storage in here as an alternative, because you can mount up to 2 SSDs or 1 hard disk drive on each of these. But then obviously this fan tray is then not able to be used for fans. So that's one of the trade-offs for it. I want to quickly show you what that looks like if you wanted to do that, but I am not going to do it. So I'm going to show you the steps for installing fans there instead in a minute. But you can see if you want to, you can put in loads of storage in this case, including drives here and in 2 other locations as well. So there's plenty of storage space in here if that's something you're looking for, if you're considering that. So the drives just sit on there, screw into those brackets, and then mount on the side there. You can see they're just clipped on, so it's really easy to take those off. And a couple of other side notes, obviously you can mount a radiator on the side there as an alternative, up to a 360mm, and there's enough room at the back to put push-pull fans on there, so you could put fans on the rear, for example. And if you're doing an upright GPU mounting, which is a separate thing entirely, you can also put fans back there and mount your graphics card to the front of that, assuming you bought the optional accessories kit, because there's an additional purchase required for that. So as you can see, there's a few different things that you can do, but as I said, I want to make it uncomplicated and show you the steps for just setting up a standard build in this case and all the things you need to know. Now, one of the things you obviously need to be aware of is the cabling at the rear. I often get asked why the RGB strip isn't working on a case, for example. It's probably because people have forgot to plug some of these cables in. So there's a bundle of cables at the rear that include the front panel USB-A, USB-C, HD audio, so 3.5mm connection, and some others. But you'll also notice there's a SATA power connection and a 5V RGB header connection, and that's because you are basically essentially connecting it up to your motherboard so that you can sync the RGB lighting with your motherboard software. So just be aware that you need to plug those things in for maximum connectivity, and I will show you how to do that later on. So stick with me for more info on the wiring setup and logic. But before that, we're going to strip the case down so that it's ready to build in. Now, there are various different fan brackets. I've already shown you the one at the rear with the SSDs and hard disk drives, but there's obviously one at the top and the bottom as well. Now, you don't actually need to remove the top one. You can theoretically mount your fans or your radiator up here without removing this, but I'm going to take it off just so I can show you how to do it. So there's a couple of screws at the back here that you need to unscrew. Obviously, put them aside safely and keep hold of those, and then it will slide out. There are some notches in there, so make sure you remember the direction that sits and the way it faces, because it's a bit tricky to get back in otherwise. The bottom one has a thumb screw at the front, which you need to undo, and then again that notches out as well. Again, this is also awkward to get back in if you don't remember which way around it goes, so just pay attention to that. Now, this rear fan tray comes out really easily because there's a push button at the back here that you just push in and then it'll lift out. Now, you can also put this in multiple ways, so you can turn it around the other way so that the radiator part faces the back. pay attention to that. I'll show you what I mean in a minute. Now there's an accessories box included with this case with a manual which covers various things, which hopefully you won't need if I do a good enough job on this video. So set that aside for now and give me a thumbs up if you are finding it useful. And then there's a little box with all the different accessories that you can see that you're going to need. And there's a mounting bracket, which is for a 420mm radiator if you want to install a larger radiator on the top of the case. And then you also have an anti-sag bracket for your graphics card, which I'm going to show you how to install later on. So that's for your standard orientation. It'll just support your GPU, and it's a very nice additional thing that's included in this case. You'll see that in the manual there's also a list of all the different screws, so you will need the manual to work out what screws are for what, and it shows you the shape and how many is included. So make a note of that and keep an eye on that as you're going through this build process. But unfortunately, there is a little bit of work to do because the little tray that it comes with, so you can see all the screws are bagged up in there. Now this is a nifty little box because you can basically segment the box off, and then you can store the different screws in different sections on it, which is very handy during the build, and also just for saving this for later if you want to do any upgrades or changes to your case. You obviously have a number of different anti-vibration mounts for your SSDs and hard disk drives, as well as a bunch of screws, some cable ties, and more. There's some little plastic slats that you can then put into the box to section off the box before you go about emptying out all the packaging and then filling each of these up. This takes some time and it is a bit of a fiddle, and I love it and I hate it because obviously it's nice to have this box, but it is a pain to have to go through this. Now these little rubber mounts are for your hard disk drives and SSDs, so you're using those. They're especially important for hard disk drives obviously because they're going to stop the noise going through the case, but you'll also use them in the various different ways when you're putting your drives in. You'll also have motherboard screws, power supply unit screws, fan screws, and more, and they're all sectioned off in there. There's also a standoff bolt for removing the standoff screws if you want to put the motherboard in a different position, because there's two different positions available in this, but I'm going to leave it in the standard position during this build to make life a little bit more straightforward. Check out my in-depth video on this, which I'll link to in the description. It talks about the different positions and what you can do with them. There are a few different ways to mount the SSDs. I've already shown you one. Another one is to put the rubber anti-vibration mounts on top here, put your screws into the holes there, and then once that's tightened up, you can then use that to notch it into the case. At the back of the case, you will have noticed that there is a door that opens up. This doubles as a tray for your SSDs. So you can actually just put your SSDs in there, and you can put several in there so you can actually easily fit them in. And this is preferable, I think, because it hides them away out of view, and it also gives you easy access to be able to plug in your cables, and they don't get in the way of the cable management either because the case is roomy enough. There'll still be plenty of space back there. Alternatively, you can use these cages at the rear. So there's two hard disk drive / SSD trays that can be removed. And I say that because you can either put hard disk drives or SSDs in there as a choice. So you could put one hard disk drive in each, or one SSD in each, or a mix of both as I'm doing here. Installation process is pretty similar. You have screws that basically fit through the holes and the rubber washers that are in there, and then screw the drive into place. Obviously you need to make sure it's facing the right way around so that the cables will be able to be plugged in, but you can't really get it wrong. The way it's designed is set up so it's pretty straightforward to do and relatively hassle-free. The same logic can be applied to SSDs, so you can put them in this tray and nestle them away. Now obviously a point of this is if you don't want to use these trays, you can actually remove them entirely from the case. You've seen they're just held in place with thumb screws. So if you're not planning on putting loads of SSDs at the back or hard disk drives, you could take these out and give you more space for cable management at the rear and just store them away separately. So that's handy too. Note that this SSD setup here uses the same screws that your motherboard installation will, so slightly different from when we put it on the door a minute ago. It then notches back into the cage at the rear, and then don't forget you'll also need to replace the thumb screws that were in the cage in the first place that held it in place at the back of the case. So you can see you've got options on where to mount your SSDs or hard disk drives if you're even going to use them, and if you're not, then you've got plenty of space to store other things. A example that I'm using in this build, for example, is I'm using one of these cages but keeping it empty a bit later on so that you can then put a fan controller in there instead. I'm going to show you the setup of the motherboard. You can skip forward. I'll leave timestamps down below if you just want to know more about the case. I'll show you all the steps for building, just straightforward. So this is an MSI Z790 motherboard, which is the Edge TI Max Wi-Fi, which has some pretty awesome highlights, including Wi-Fi 7 compatibility and the ability to work with PCIe Gen 5 NVMe SSD, so super fast speeds available in there. It's also a very capable board which supports DDR5 up to a very fast speed, and you'll see it looks really nice and suits this case really well as well. I'll leave all the specs down below in the description so you can find out more, but obviously we're going to go through the setup process now for this board. One of the nice things about it is it's really easy for the installation of your NVMe SSDs, because as you can see, that top slot basically removes with just a clip. Under there are some thermal pads with some stickers on top. You need to remove those thermal pads before installing your drive. Now, I'm using the FireCuda 540, which is a Gen 5 drive here, and you'll notice that it just notches into place. There's just a little latch that goes down over that and holds it down, rather than an M2 screw that's traditional. You can then put the heat shielding back on, and I would recommend doing this because it helps keep the drive running cool, and those Gen 5 drives can run particularly hot. The motherboard also gives you other options, but as an alternative, you can also use something like Corsair's MP700 Pro, which has its own built-in heat shield, and it has a fan in it and requires SATA power separately from your power supply unit in order to make the most of it. Now, I did notice that I did have to use a screwdriver sometimes with those latches, so just keep that in mind if you are planning on using a similar motherboard. On the bottom of the motherboard, you can remove more heat shielding and more stickers for access to more thermal pads, and there's multiple drive ports on here. I've done a fully in-depth video on this motherboard and some of the interesting highlights of it. As I've said, you can use a Gen 5 port at the top for your Gen 5 drives, but these other NVMe ports down here are also Gen 4, so you can have multiple PCIe Gen 4 NVMe SSDs as well as a Gen 5 drive in there, although that does give you less GPU lanes for your PCIe graphics card, which is worth bearing in mind. And I've done a test on that too, so worth checking out that video, link down below. The heat shielding on this does make a difference though, so I would recommend replacing these, not just because they look nice, but they also help with thermal transfer to keep your drives running cool. And you want to make sure they are running cool, because if they get too hot, they will thermally throttle and you may lose performance, which is obviously less than ideal. Quick note, you've seen I put the FireCuda in the lower ports now. It will run at Gen 4 speeds instead of Gen 5. But they are backwards compatible, so you are able to do that if you want to. It's obviously not making the most of the hardware, but it is something to keep in mind. Now for this, I'm using an i9-13900K, but this board will actually work with 12th, 13th and 14th gen CPUs, so you do have the option, if you upgrade the BIOS, to put a 14th gen Intel CPU in there instead. I'm using 2 sticks of DDR5 Corsair Vengeance RAM, and you want to slot that into slots A2 and B2, which is the second slot from the left and then the fourth one closest to the edge. That will ensure that they run at the right speed and that the system boots properly. Now, I'm also preparing this for the all-in-one cooler that I'm going to be using. So there is a back plate that goes through the back of the motherboard. This is an LG A1700 socket motherboard. Now, I've done an in-depth guide on the Lian Li Galahad 2 LCD cooler. A setup and wiring guide for that I'll link to in the description if you want to find out more about it, because I am doing things slightly differently here by using different fans and my own thermal paste, and that's just simply because I'm reusing this AIO, so we'll get to that in a little while. This is a 1000 watt power supply unit, a co-link regulator, which is a modular power supply, and I want to quickly show you the steps for setting it up, because it's worth bearing in mind plugging in the cables you're going to need, where they're going to be plugging in, and how you'd wire them at the back of the case. Now, this is actually a very small 1000 watt power supply unit, which is an interesting point here. One of the things you'll notice is just how much room you have at the rear of the case, because the power supply unit cage actually juts out a little bit. So if you do have a larger power supply unit, you may find it's not a problem installing that still. We're going to install quite a few different cables. Now, I have a full wiring guide on this power supply unit if you need it for other things. So I've done a lot of separate videos related to this that are worth checking out, and I'll link them all down below in the description. But this is nicely marked up as a modular power supply, telling you where things need to plug in so you can plug in each and everything. You will see it also has the 12 volt 600 watt power connector on there as well for the modern graphics cards. I'll quickly show you the steps for various different things. So obviously for wiring up and powering your motherboard, you would want a 24-pin motherboard power cable, which is this one, which is split into two parts on the power supply end. Now I'm showing you the steps now outside the case so you can see it really clearly, but I'll also show you it wiring in later on properly when it's finished so that you can get an idea of how to do that. But it is important to secure all these cables at both ends, and I would recommend plugging in the cables to the power supply unit now so you've got them plugged in before you put them in the case, because it'll make it easier to build with. Now the cable that hooks into the motherboard goes on the right hand side there, and you'll notice there's a clip on that. You need to make sure that is properly secured and seated in there and clipped in. If this cable's loose, then your power may not come on and your PC might not boot, so worth keeping in mind. Now this motherboard also has CPU power connectors, two 8-pin power connectors that you need to find. You see the markings for CPU power connectors on here, or PCIe connectors. So we want to put those in the relevant ports and then plug them into the top left, obviously once you've finished the build, but this is where that would go. This is used for overclocking your CPU and giving extra juice to your system. It is important to plug those in and make sure they're in use, especially if you're using an i9 and a powerful CPU and you want to make the most of it. So they plug in the top left. Again, it's the same sort of logic. There's plastic clips on the edge of the connectors. You can only plug them in one way. You'll notice that the shape of them is slightly different on each of the ports, so it's difficult to plug them in wrong. And you shouldn't have a problem with it if you're pushing them in the right direction and clipping them into place. Next is the power cables for the SSDs and hard disk drives. This will also work with fan controllers. Pay attention to that because we're going to use this later on. But this is a flat SATA power connector. There's daisy chain. You can see there are multiple connectors on a single cable. So one end plugs into the power supply unit, and then the other end you're able to connect up multiple drives to it. Look for the markings for SATA on your power supply unit and plug in that end there, fully securing it in. Now it is worth often plugging in a couple of these, especially if you're using multiple drives and multiple fan controllers and things, because although you can daisy chain, it's still worth separating out some to ensure you've got maximum power across the board. So maybe, for example, just using two for the SSDs and then a separate cable for others, and plan this out based on what you're putting in the system. For example, I'm putting two SSDs in here, but I also need power for the case for the RGB lighting and for the fan controller. Alternatively, you might also need one for your all-in-one cooler as well. So you may have a SATA connection for that requires power. So there are multiple different things you may well need to connect up to this. So just keep that in mind. For the data connection from the SSDs, in case you don't know, that runs from the drive and then connects to the bottom right-hand side of the motherboard. On this motherboard, there's 6 SATA ports at this angle and then another 2 along the very bottom edge as well. So you can potentially connect up multiple drives. So it's perfect for this case because you've already seen how many different positions you can put SSDs and hard disk drives in, and then you can connect them up. Again, I'm just showing you this now outside the case so you can see clearly how they connect up, but I'll show you in a minute how to wire them in once they're actually installed, because that's when you'd want to do it. For the graphics card wiring, this is going to vary depending on what you've got. So I'm going to quickly start off with the PCIe connections. So these are standard 8-pin power connectors, and this is an RTX 3090 from Gigabyte, so an older generation of GPUs. You'll see with this power supply, you actually have 3 cables, 2 that are single connectors on one end, and a third one which is a sort of daisy chain affair with a pigtail connector on the end of that. So ideally you want to use the 2 separate connectors where possible. So this graphics card requires 2 8-pin power connectors. So we look for the PCIe connections on the power supply end, plug the cable into that, and then the other end plugs into the graphics card. 2 separate power connectors will ensure maximum power for the graphics card and that it gets the best performance possible there. This is obviously one step. You'll use this with an NVIDIA graphics card, AMD and Intel, but you may well find that the newer graphics cards out there require the 600 watt connector instead, and I'll show you the difference for that in a second. So as I said, this is the 3090, 2 8-pin power connectors. You may well find that you have 3 connectors on your graphics card or just 2. Now these 8-pin connectors are actually split into 2 parts. So they are pushed together here and clipped in place, and then you can just push them in. You do need to make sure these are pushed in and seated all the way. Once your graphics card's in place and you're putting these cables in, just notch them in and push them in carefully. If you look closely, you'll actually see the one on the left isn't fully seated, and that could result in problems with performance of the graphics card or it's just not working entirely. So it's really important to make sure they're seated properly at both ends of the power supply unit when it's fully installed in your system to get the best performance out of it. Just note that, because it can be a bit tricky. Now, as I said, you also have the option to use this additional cable if you require a third power cable, and that may well be handy for more power hungry GPUs or adapters that you might use for newer series graphics cards. So some of the 40 series come with additional cables. But alternatively, if you're using a 40 series like this Gigabyte 4070 Ti, you can make use of this dedicated power cable. This basically has one cable at each end, one single connector on it that connects straight to that 12-volt high power connector on the graphics card, and it makes life a lot easier because you don't have to use the included adapter that comes with your GPU that usually requires multiple of the traditional PCIe power connectors on it. So this cable is actually really nice, easy to fit into there, but you do need to make sure it's fully seated. Take care to make sure this is connected up fully to your GPU. This is even more important because that's a very power intensive cable, and there has been problems with these cables melting if they're not properly seated in your graphics card, or if there's unnecessary tension on either end of them. So make sure it's pushed all the way into your power supply unit in that special slot. You can't plug this in wrong, and then fully seated the other end into your GPU as well. And then just make sure you're not pulling it at weird angles once you've got it in the case. So you can see the way it slots into this 4070 here. You'll notice the 600 watt markings on the top of it, and then it just slides in. And again, push that in until it clips into place. It's really important. Otherwise, it won't work properly. So that's the setup for the GPUs. Now, there is actually an additional use for power cabling in this build. So I want to talk about that because this is going to vary from case to case, but in this one we're using the Lian Li TL120 and 120 LCD fans. Now these actually require an additional power cable because these fans are unifans that use a controller with 4 ports on it, can control up to 16 fans or 7 of those LCD fans, but you'll see it has multiple connectors on it, one of which actually requires one of those 6-pin PCIe power cables. That's the same one I used on the 3090 a minute ago. You split it in two by removing one end of it, so you can see that it's possible just to take that end off by sliding it out of the power connector, and then you'll use this. Now this is going to make things a bit trickier. I've done a separate video on the wiring logic of these fans, but in this instance it's going to be fine for me because I already have a 40 series card, so I'm using that additional adapter. So I've got spare PCIe power cables, but if you haven't, that's something to bear in mind with this build. Then, as I said, make sure you're plugging in all the cables you know you're going to be using just so that they're ready, because it makes life a lot easier. It's less fiddly, and it also just gives you easier access to be able to do it. Then put the power supply so that the fan faces the outside of the case, because you've seen at the beginning there's a mesh case, so there's airflow through there. This will pull cold air into the power supply and keep it cold and running properly. And then we secure it with 4 screws into the corners. You'll notice what I was talking about earlier on about how the power supply sticks out at the side of the case to give you more room. But you'll also see, even with all the cables stuffed into the back of the case, there's plenty of space in there. Now we're going to mount the motherboard. Now this motherboard has a pre-installed I/O shield on it, so you can just mount it into there without any worries about that. Put it down on top of the ATX standoffs, and then use the motherboard screws that are included with the case to screw it down into place. There are 9 screws holding it down here. And as I said earlier on, this is in the standard position. So this is the position it's in. You can actually move the standoffs up if you want to and have it in a different position. Then the connectors. So this is the USB-A connector for your front panel connections. Plug that in, run it from the side there, and then the USB-C connector there. So these will both only go in one way, and with the USB-C one you want to make sure you hear a click when you push it in, then you'll know that it's fully seated and that the port will work properly on the front panel connectors. We then have the other connections here, so you'll see that we've got a front panel connector for your power switch and things. So you just run that to the bottom right front panel connector on your motherboard. Look at the manual, but it's usually marked something like JFP1, for example, or front panel. And then HD audio goes on the far left hand side, in this instance JAUD1, and that's your 3.5mm connection. And then there's the 5-volt RGB header, and that is for the RGB lighting strips on the case, as I mentioned earlier. So if you plug that in, you'll then be able to sync that lighting. But don't forget, you'll also need to connect that SATA power connector as well as the RGB connector to make the most of it. So we can then use that same cable that we use for the SSDs to plug in the case to power that RGB lighting on. The RGB lighting can be controlled by a button on the case, but it can also be controlled by syncing with your motherboard software. In this case, it would be MSI Mystic Light. Then we'll run the other power cables through. So we've got the 24-pin power cable from the power supply unit running through here, through the rubber grommeted areas, into the right-hand side of the motherboard, and then plug that in. Again, make sure that's pushed in all the way so it clips nicely into place and is secured down there. A little bit fiddly to get nice and neat there, but with a little bit of fiddling, you should be able to get it looking nice, especially thanks to this cable management system at the rear. So if we run the two 8-pin CPU power connectors up there, you'll see there are multiple hooks and loops that you can run these through. There are some Velcro ties here, and these are really handy because they mean you don't have to use plastic cable ties at this point, but you can still neaten things up. And that means that you can then check to make sure everything's working properly before you go about fully tightening and sorting things at the end, if that's something you want to do. We obviously have to run those two 8-pin CPU power connectors up to the top here, and it is easiest to do it now rather than when we mount the all-in-one cooler, because in this build I'm going to mount a 360mm all-in-one cooler at the top, and it's just much easier to do the power cabling before that. Don't forget to plug in the SATA power connectors for your hard disk drives and SSDs if you're going to be using them, and as I said, for the RGB lighting and anything else that you're using, or at least making sure you've got enough spare there to do that. So these just notch into that dock at the back, and you can loop those two connectors together. Now I'm using the Unifan TLs here, so you get a triple pack. These are reverse blade fans, which mean they're going to be pulling air from the rear of the case through into the case itself. These fans are nicely set up with a little display in the middle you can adjust with temps, GIFs, and all sorts of other things. I've done a video separately on these that I'll link to in the description. They are Unifans, which means you can click 3 fans together and then set them up in the case really easily with just one connector connecting to the control box. You can have up to 7 of these fans in the case if you want to, and you can do it in groups. So you can have 3 on one port, 3 on another, and then a single fan on that controller. And the connections for them are pretty simple because you'll see that basically have metal pins on the ends. They slot together, and then you just got one power cable that runs to the controller. I've done a full in-depth wiring guide talking about all the sort of logic and ins and outs of this that I'll link to. That's worth looking at if you're considering these fans, because they're a bit more complicated than Lian Li's previous Uni fans, especially if you're mixing and matching them with the other TL fans, as I am, because the wiring is slightly different and what you can do with it is slightly different too. So some interesting setup there, but you'll see we have pins sticking out on one end, these metal contacts on the other. You slide the connector in, and then you're basically wiring it in. And the one thing that's interesting as well is you'll see that there is a wire notch here, so you can actually put your cable in a different direction depending on where you're planning on mounting the fans, so that you can run that cable a bit more neatly to the rear, because we're going to run the cables from it to the rear of the case so that we can then plug them into the controller. Because these are reverse blade fans, we're going to put them so the screen faces in towards the case, obviously. I also have to remove the rubber covers that are hiding away the little screw holes for the fans, and then we're going to line up the radiator tray. Now notice that I put it so that the bracketing sits towards the back. This makes it a little bit neater. So this tray can be used for radiators, so you can put a 360mm radiator on there, for example, or it can be used for fans, and you can choose which way around it goes depending on how you're going to mount it. So if you're going to put a 360mm radiator on it, you might mount it with those side brackets towards the front. In this instance, I'm using it with fans instead, so I might want to sit it in a different position or it's a bit neater. So you can do this, then obviously screw the screws in from the rear, and that will still keep things nice and neat. And you can see you can't see any screws on the front because it's got those covers on. So these are some really clean looking fans, nicely designed and easy to set up. There's some pretty cool options in terms of the lighting, as you've seen earlier, and I'll show you some more of that later on. Then obviously with the connector in place, you'd then run that to the back. You'll notice that I've set this up so that the cabling is on the bottom. So pay attention to that when you're installing these fans, because otherwise you might end up with a cable at the top, because you can only put the cable on one end for these fans. So you'd set that up and then run it through to the controller. And The one thing to note here, or a little important point to note here, if you're using LCD ones, is not to use port 1 on the controller, because for some reason that's not a good port to use. You're better off using 2, 3, or 4. If you're using the LCD fans, it can be problematic otherwise. So that's the setup of those fans. Obviously, nice intake fan set on the side, give good cooling, and then we need to wire them in. So the controller has multiple different cables that need to be plugged in order to ensure that it works properly and can power the fans and the RGB. That one connector, as I mentioned before, is that 8-pin PCIe power connector, which could be problematic if you don't have extras. So you need to make sure that you've got one of those. The other ones are the USB header, a 5-volt RGB header, and system fan connections. Now, as a basic, you only need to use the USB connector if you want to control it with L-Connect. If you want to control the lighting and fan speed with your motherboard software, you'll have to use a 5-volt RGB header and the system fan header, and that will ensure that you can then control those via your motherboard software. If you plug in all these cables, you have the option to do either, but as a minimum you need that USB connection in the bottom middle of your motherboard to then ensure that you can control the fans via L-Connect software. Now these are Lian Li's TL120 fans without the display on, so similar sort of setup, and these again are reverse blade ones that came in a triple pack, and they are quite similar, although the connection options are different because you can actually run a cable from either end of the fans. I'm putting them now on the bottom fan tray, the idea being here that I'm going to pull cold air from underneath the case into the case, obviously then blowing onto the graphics card for good cooling performance. Again, you need to remove the rubber covers for the various fan holes here, and then we're going to flip the fans and the tray over and screw it down. Now, I'm using 120mm fans here. You do have the option to use 140 instead, but we need to secure these fans in with the relevant screws and then attach it to the bottom of the case. So where we took it out earlier on and you've got that thumb screw in there, you obviously need to line that notch back up and slot it in. It's a little bit fiddly to do if you're not paying attention to the way it came out, so make sure you noted how it came out when you put it back in, and then don't forget to re-secure that thumb screw on the right hand side to make sure it's secured in place, and then you can run a cable on either end. I choose to run my cables from the left hand side because then you can run them, basically hide them away quite neatly down the bottom there. So this is a good thing about these uni fans. You've only got a single cable coming out of a group of fans that runs to the rear, and you can choose the direction it goes from and which side it comes out of the fans as well. Benefit of these reverse blade fans is you get to see the front of the fans rather than the back, but it's still pulling cold air in from underneath, so it looks aesthetically nice but still gives you some good cooling performance. Again, we've then got to run that connector to the control box, which you can see is now nestled away in the SSD cage like I mentioned earlier on, so there's room in there. If you've got a single SSD, you can put the controller in there, so that's a good option. Now I'm looking at the mounting of the 360mm radiator. I know I'm going to put this on top, but which way round do we want it? Am I going to put it with the tubes towards the rear or the tubes towards the front? Now this is going to be a personal preference. Obviously with the LCD fans, if I put it with tubes towards the front, they may be blocking them, so I'm going to end up with them on the rear instead. Now as standard, this radiator comes with infinity fans, but I'm swapping it for these TL fans instead, just because I want to keep the fans the same throughout. If you are going to use infinity fans and you're curious, you will need the infinity controller. So you'll end up with two controllers in the system because you can't run TL and infinity fans on the same controller. At least that's what Lian Li says. I've not been able to test that, but it's something to keep in mind. You might end up with two controllers on your system if you are mixing and matching Lian Li's uni fans in there. Now these are the standard orientation fans, so in this instance the air is actually exhausting through the radiator, so these fans will be pulling air out of the case through the radiator and then out of the top of the case. So I'm mounting the radiator to the fan tray. Now I mentioned earlier on in the video that you don't need to remove the fan tray from the top of the case, but I was just doing demonstrate that you can. You could alternatively put the fan tray back on now and then mount the radiator that way. What I'm doing instead is mounting the radiator to the fan tray with the screws that are included with the AIO and then positioning it into the case that way. You can see that you can also adjust the position. There is some room to move either left or right, so I'd recommend maybe screwing the screws in a little bit loose so you can then check you're happy with the orientation before you fully seat it in and set it up. You can always tighten these up in a little while, but that allows you to move it left and right depending on where you want those tubes. So obviously we're putting it with the tubes towards the rear in this instance, and I'm also going to be installing a rear fan, so I might want to slip it slightly towards the front of the case or to the right if you're looking at this orientation. And now we put it back in, obviously we need to re-secure those little screws that we took out earlier on to make sure the fan tray is held in as it should. So now I'm applying some MX4 CPU thermal paste to the i9-13900K, and I like to put a bit of a blob on there and then use a small spatula to spread it across the entirety of the IHS to make sure that there's good coverage there. This ensures good thermal transfer and the CPU runs cool. A nice thin cover across the whole of the thing should sort it out nicely. And then we're going to seat down that pump head over the top. Now it's worth noting you don't actually have to use thermal paste if you're using this cooler as it came out of the box, because it does have its own thermal paste, so you don't need to buy the MX4 necessarily separately, but you do need to then set it up and put all the standoffs in place, obviously screwing those thumb screws down, making sure they're nice and tight and set up well. And then there's some other cables to deal with, because we've got this single cable coming out of here, which I'd recommend connecting up to the CPU fan header on your motherboard. You have the option of CPU fan or pump fan 1 on this motherboard. But CPU fan will ensure that the pump's getting the juice it needs to run, but also that your motherboard doesn't complain that it's not monitoring the CPU fan speed. So we plug that into that connector there, and then we also have the additional cable. So there's another cable which comes out the side, which is the USB connection. This one can be problematic, so if you are having any problems with it, make sure that it is seated properly in there, because you have to push it in quite far until it clicks into place. If that's loose, then you may well have issues with the display. I mean, I've been troubleshooting problems with this cooler. That was one of the main causes. That, and I'd also recommend making sure you use a USB port on the bottom of the motherboard that's dedicated just to that and nothing else. So don't combine it with multiple other things in a USB hub or other ways. So just use a single connector at the bottom there. So then the fans on the radiator, obviously, once again, they have a connector, and that runs to the controller as well. Now, it's worth noting that in Lian Li's L-Connect software, you can then set these fans, remember what group you put them in, set those fans up so that they then ramp up depending on the temperature of your CPU. So you can do that in L-Connect quite easily. I'm then going to put another fan at the rear here, and this is obviously another exhaust fan. So we now have 6 fans intaking, 3 on the bottom, 3 on the side, and then 4 exhausting, 3 on the top, 1 at the rear. And they're all controlled from that single controller that I showed you earlier on. And obviously there's just one cable coming from each of those groups as well. So these are really easy to set up and nice and neat in terms of the cabling and the setup there. Now, with the exception of the graphics card, we have the PC mostly built. Obviously, we need to make sure everything is plugged in, as I've shown you, including all the fans. You want to make sure, obviously, that they're connected to the controller is connected to the motherboard, power cables are connected, everything's plugged in properly. Otherwise, you might have some issues. But this is why I mentioned earlier on that plastic cable ties could be a bit tricky, because if you do find something's loose and you've tied a lot of other things down, it can be a problem. So now is probably the time to test these things out. Run that USB-C cable from the AIO pump header through to the bottom of the case, and then plug that into the bottom USB port. And then we should mostly be ready to finalize this off. Now, I'm using the 600 watt power cable from the graphics card for this build. So to make sure there's not too much tension on it, I'm actually running it as neatly as possible as I can down to the bottom middle, because it's then going to pop out at the front, and then I'm going to put the GPU in there. Obviously, we're using the top slot for the PCIe X16 graphics card port, and that will ensure that the GPU runs at its fastest possible speed and works well. And we're going to also use the GPU anti-sag bracket now as well, because I want to demonstrate that. So this is a neat little addition to the case I'd recommend using. This will work with both ATX and E-ATX motherboards, so if you're a slightly different version of a motherboard you want to use in here, a bigger one, you can still use this. There's a setup guide for it in the box, but it is fairly straightforward. So as standard, there's this one bracket with a numbering on it. You need to put this additional bracket on top of it, and then a little pad on top of that. There's a screw that screws into that, and then this basically attaches to the standoff screws that are already in the motherboard. So when we put the motherboard in, obviously it was sitting on top of standoffs that were on the case, and then we put screws on top of that to screw the motherboard down. So what we'll do here is we'll remove those 2 silver screws that we put in earlier, and then I'm going to put some extra standoffs in that are included with the anti-sag bracket setup. So the longer ones, the black ones will then sit on top. So what you've got then is basically you've got standoff and then motherboard and then another standoff and then the bracket and then screws to hold that in place. So you can see this black standoff there that then mounts into the standoff that's in the case through the motherboard. This basically lets the anti-sag bracket sit a little bit higher off the motherboard, closer to the GPU. And this is really neat because it's one of the nicer anti-sag brackets I've seen, because it doesn't require you to find somewhere in the case where it can sit, as in coming from the bottom, for example, because a lot of GPUs will include an anti-sag bracket, but it needs to sit flat on the bottom of the case, which obviously it can't do here because we've got fans on the bottom. So we put the standoffs in both those positions and those bottom 2 right spots in place of the standard silver motherboard screws that are there. And then we're going to put the bracket down over the top. Now, the process is slightly different for the E-ATX one, but the setup for the ATX version looks like this. So that is how it is set up, ready to go. You basically just put that down on top of it there, and then we use the motherboard screws to screw that down. Now, there's actually some black screws as an alternative to the silver ones we used, so you have a choice between those. You opt for the black ones, you've got a stealthy setup there, but obviously that's going to look different from the other motherboard screws that are there, but I mean, that's personal preference. Doesn't really matter. It's the same screws. You screw that down, and then you can basically put the clip on the right hand side. So there's basically a push button on the anti-sag bracket. You can drop that down into the lower position, put your GPU in, and then slide it up so it basically holds the end of the graphics card and supports it, obviously without putting any extra pressure anywhere, and it's just giving some relief, which over time will be beneficial, especially if you've got a large heavy GPU. That might be problematic. So this is Gigabyte 4070 Ti, which is fairly long and, as you can see, pretty large. Probably not the largest out there, but it is pretty chunky. Secure it with the thumb screws that held the PCIe brackets in place. Make sure they're tightened up nice. That'll secure it at one end, and then at the other end we'll use the anti-sag bracket to just give it that extra support. So you'll see here as well, there's plenty of space still moving further out for a larger GPU. So if you're going for a 4090, for example, it should be fine. Also in this setup, I'm happy to report that the 600 watt cable will connect up nice and easily here without pressing up against the glass. So I haven't had any problems there putting any extra tension on it from the glass on the case. You do obviously need to try and neaten it up as much as possible because it is running down to the bottom, but you can then adjust it, make sure it's in there securely and not causing any problems, and then just turn your PC on and see if everything's booting up as expected. You can see the RGB lighting isn't actually working on the fans here, so there was a cable that I hadn't connected properly, so basically went back and checked the controller, and then everything's working as expected. You can see we've got the LCD displays as standard. They're actually set sideways here. You can rotate them in L-Connect, which I've gone into more depth on in that video, and you can adjust the lighting in there as well. And then obviously adjusting the GPU anti-sag bracket, put the glass panels back on, and then you've got a PC that's fully built. Now this is just one option for what you can do with this case. Obviously there are alternatives, but I'm pretty happy with how it's come out. And hopefully this has been a helpful video giving you some good insights into what you can do with the case, how to set it up in a standard position. Obviously there's extra alternative things that you can do. For example, you can also get a vertical GPU mount, and there is a support bracket that runs down the front of the case, which you can also remove. If you found this useful, subscribe for more. Thanks for watching. You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.